Good morning, folks. As you enter the room here, we're going to give it about one more minute to get started, just to let a few more folks come in. Just for those that have just joined, we're going to give it about 45 more seconds before we start, just to see if a few more folks join. All right. Well, good afternoon, folks. Thank you for taking the time to join us here today. My name is Will Flanders. I'm the Research Director at the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, joined today by Mark Porter McGee from 50CAN. And we're going to go over some recent poll results that 50CAN collected in Wisconsin, as well as around the country. We can go on to the first slide here.
Yep.
Next slide.
Yep.
And Mark, if you want to do a little bit of a discussion about what 50CAN is.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and partner on this work. So 50CAN is a network of state education advocacy groups all over the country, from Hawaii to Georgia and a lot of states in between. We are really locally driven, nationally supported. And each state campaign is a little different, but all of them are focused on trying to bring a student-centered future of education into reality through policy change and a lot of community work. And so we work directly with parents and teachers and concerned citizens to help them emerge as powerful advocates. We also work with educational entrepreneurs as they are piloting new approaches to education, and directly with elected officials on state level policy change. So that's what we're all about. And I'm excited to talk about this survey, which is one of our bigger initiatives of the past year. But before I do that, I'll kick it back for a little discussion of Will.
Yeah, just a very brief overview of the work we do for anyone who's not familiar. And one thing I neglected to mention is we'll have the chat open. And as we go through the results here, if you see things that you'd like to ask a question about, feel free to put that in the chat. And then as we finish up the discussion, we'll go back and go through all the questions there. So just a little bit about Will. We're a law and policy firm located in Milwaukee. On both sides, we have a lot of crossover in the work we do, work on school choice, obviously very relevant to the work we're presenting today. Also, we have a Restoring American Education project focused on improving public education across a lot of different dimensions, also very relevant for this discussion. And then we have some work in other areas, including free speech and healthcare, a lot of stuff you'll see in the upcoming session there. So with that, we can feel free to get into the results of the survey.
That's great. So I'm going to just quickly explain a little bit about the background of the survey before we get specifically into the state level results. So much of our work at 50CAN is about trying to listen to parents and figure out what they want for their kids and then help make those opportunities available. And as we've had an opportunity to work across so many different states, one of the things we realized is that state level information from parents is really critical. But it's also helpful to have some context for where your state compares to other states. And as we were looking around, one of the things we realized is it's actually quite rare to have a public opinion survey of parents that captures information across all 50 states. So we decided we were in a position to try to bring that to life and then make that activity a partnership with local groups on the ground in the state. So that's what this project was all about. So in order to have a representative sample in a state, you need about 400 parents. So if you imagine 400 times 50, that's 20,000. That's how we ended up with a 20,000 person poll, which is one of the biggest polls of parents in the last several years. We were excited to be able to partner to bring these results to life in Wisconsin. So we have 403 respondents. And the poll is designed to be representative across all the the major things that you'd want it to be. So representative in terms of race and ethnicity in the state, representative in terms of income, but also representative in terms of school type, and a bunch of other dimensions. So we think it's a great window into what parents want. And the other thing that was really important to us is there are elements of it which are opinion questions. So we wanted to know, parents' levels of satisfaction and these sort of things. But it's also a lot of questions that are factual, that help us understand what parents are experiencing with their kids, the opportunities they have, the choices they've made in where they've sent their kids to school. So we think that is also really helpful for us to understand what's actually going on right now in this key moment in time, 3 or 4 years after the huge disruptions to education, and while we're all working to help our kids recover from that.
Great. Yeah, Mark. And I think from our side, we think that, getting a poll that sort of zeroes in on parents, we obviously know parents were a huge driving force in the 2024 presidential election, and to see it at the state level is a really important thing to see. So with that, we can get into some of the questions.
Awesome. So what we're going to do is we've looked through the data and we've pulled out some key areas that we think are at the heart of the conversation we're all having about our schools. And I'm going to share a little bit and give a little overview of the survey results, and then we'll talk about them and we'll go through each of those this way. So we wanted to start with satisfaction, which is such a bedrock question. How satisfied are parents with the overall quality of education their children are receiving? And in the survey, what we're able to do is not just provide an answer for that. In terms of the Wisconsin average, we're able to break that out by income level. So we can look at low income families compared to middle and high income families. And low income is a household income of $60,000 or less. But we're also able to compare it against other states. And so what you see when you look at this data, what you'll see is on the left is the breakout in terms of low income, middle, and high income state average and the national average in terms of school satisfaction. But on the right, you'll also be able to see that in an ordered ranking of all the states. And what comes through to me when I look at this data, obviously Wisconsin is a little below the national average, but about right in the middle in terms of the ranking of states. And one thing you'll see here that is a pattern, I think, that carries through a lot of the results is in some states, you have these very big differences between low income and middle and high income families, and basically none on the satisfaction level.
Yeah, that's one thing I was going to bring up, and I mean, maybe we'll get into this a little more with some of the subsequent slides. But in thinking about this, and we think about the robust school choice programs we have in Wisconsin, do you think that could be a potential reason behind some of the clustering that we see?
I think that's right. I think there's always in every state there's things you need to work on. There's things you're doing well. You want to build on your strengths. You want to then address the weaknesses. And I think that one indication that perhaps public policy is doing its job is when you don't see those huge income disparities, because it means that no matter where you live, no matter what access to resources you have, there's some way to tap into a public system that equalizes some of those opportunities. So that's a good thing. So we'll jump to the next one. So this is about parental choice. And I think these results are really interesting. So a lot of times when we're talking about these programs, we don't really get to what parents are feeling. We can measure the different aspects of the growth of different programs. So pretty simple question. Do you feel like you have a choice in what school this child attends? And what you see is two really important things. One is that Wisconsin is in the top quarter of all the states in the country on parents feeling like they have a choice, above the national average. But also, as we were saying before, there's almost no difference between low-income families and high-income families in feeling like they have a choice, which I think is a huge accomplishment and a real strength to build upon.
Yeah, and as we look at this, we're the state with we say we're the home of the original school choice program. Vermont can take exception to that with a program that goes back to the 1800s. But in terms of modern school choice, Milwaukee particularly is the home of a program that's been around since 1990. Sort of the basis for a lot of school choice we see around the country. And while we'd like to see 100% of families say they have school choice, and obviously there's room to work to improve that even further, this certainly speaks to the extent to which the families feel like they are empowered to have choice. And while we'll talk about some negative things here, this is one of the more positive results of the poll for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a real, for all of the advocates that have worked so hard over the last 20 years on this, it's something I think you can really point to and feel great about. All right, so let's talk into some of the challenges. So this is, I think, a big one. So, so we ask satisfaction questions. Do you feel like you have a choice? We also ask about different knowledge questions. So, anyone who's ever run a business or just managed your household finances knows it starts with understanding your own budget, understanding how money is spent. So if we want parents to feel a sense of ownership over school, to feel like they're involved, do they feel like they're very familiar with how budget decisions are made in their child's school? So this was low all over the country. So you see on the far right, only 20% of families, of parents with school-age children say that they're very familiar. It's even lower in Wisconsin, so just 13%. And I think this is a big area where greater fiscal transparency, greater involvement with families, better ways to bring them into the process could make a big difference.
Yeah, this is one thing we wanted to highlight here. We worked on a bill a couple sessions ago that actually was signed by Governor Evers to create a better transparency within DPI to make that information more readily available to families. What we've seen is that DPI has been dragging its feet in implementing this. And as you say, Mark, there's obviously a need to increase familiarity with this information as we're constantly talking about increasing budgets, and it's good to understand where the money is going, certainly. What would you say? Maybe an argument here is that numeracy is low across the country, right? Across people as a whole. So maybe we can't really expect much growth here. What would you say in that regard?
Well, I think it's certainly true that we can all be pretty intimidated by a Excel spreadsheet with just row after row of information. I also think it's important that we take responsibility for presenting the information in a way where people can exercise their civic duty to provide that oversight. So I think it's up to district and school leaders to make this information accessible in ways that parents can understand. All right, let's jump into the next one. All right, so school performance. So there's a lot here to talk about. But one of the things we were really interested in is there isn't just one way for parents to find out how their kids are doing. There's a lot of different avenues for that. So we wanted to ask parents, what have they done in the most recent school year? So you'll see on the left, there's 7 or 8 different ways in which parents were asked how they get involved. The highest we saw was around attending a parent-teacher conference. And the lowest was around attending a school board meeting, which is unfortunately for those of us involved in a lot of local advocacy, we know that while there are a lot of decisions made in school board meetings, they often aren't super well attended and can be hard to participate in. But one of the things we've found is that this is another area where the majority of parents are not taking advantage of or don't feel like they have access to all the different ways that you could get involved. So only about a quarter of parents, for example, talking to a guidance counselor, which can be super important. So I think this is an area when a school is thriving, they should be having much higher numbers across all these different dimensions. Now, in overall, you'll see on the right when we look at just school performance. So do you compare your school's student performance to other schools? Wisconsin does pretty well, especially compared to neighbors of Michigan and Minnesota, which are pretty low on that list. So that's
Yeah.
my take.
One thing we wanted to highlight here is while 28% is relatively high, and again something we can hang our hat on to some extent. That still means the vast majority of folks aren't taking advantage or using that information. And one thing we've seen in Wisconsin in recent months that I'm sure a lot of folks on this call are familiar with is that DPI, our Department of Public Instruction, has been making changes to the standards. They've lowered the proficiency level that's required to be judged proficient. There have been changes to our state report card. So do you think that, given the supposition there are all these changes, could that affect the extent to which people are too confused to sort of make use of this data?
That is a good question. I do think that all of the changes, every time we have a change in a reset, it can be then a new learning curve. You change out a test, you change out a cut score, you change out the way things are presented. So I think for every change you make, you need to put in enough resources to explain that change, and connect them in. This is a different example from outside of education, but in Washington, D.C., they recently passed a law that said it's no longer legal to take a turn on a right-hand turn on a red light, but they didn't put in any money to put up any signs for that. So they recently passed a law that you can't actually get pulled over for doing it because they didn't have the money to educate people. So I think, when you're thinking about a change, make sure you put in the resources to actually explain the change as well.
Makes it a better fundraiser though, right? If no one knows about it. So.
Right, exactly. Yeah. All right. So I think this is where the rubber meets the road when we get to these questions. So this is a question that asks parents, how confident are you that your child will be equipped with the knowledge, skills, and competencies to succeed in the workforce? We know whenever we talk to parents, they say this is one of their number one goals. We ask, what do you want the school system to do? We want the school system to prepare our kids to succeed when they leave and go into the world of work. You can see here that overall, the national average is pretty low for that level of confidence that we set, but it's all even lower in Wisconsin. Even lower, a little bit lower for low-income families. And when you look on the map on the right, you can see that there are some parts of the country where this is higher, a little lower in the Midwest, and then even lower here in Wisconsin than Minnesota and Michigan.
So as we think about sort of the changing expectations for kids post high school, right? We've seen my generation, folks around 40, we were the generation that was told everyone needs to go to college. That's the only sort of pathway to success. We're seeing now more and more folks realizing there are other pathways out there. We'll talk about the college stuff on the subsequent slide, but I think maybe this speaks to the extent to which schools are not really keeping up with the changing dynamics, right? That folks are wanting those maybe things that they can get with a 2-year degree, or they can get some training in high school and move on straight to the workforce. Is that something you see in your polling, that across the country there's sort of a lack in the things that go right into work ready careers or education for the workforce?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think one of the questions we asked about just of the high school parents in the total national survey was what kind of high school programs their kids are participating in. So if you ask them, is your high schooler participating in a career and technical education program, I think it's about 17% say yes. But if you ask them, how important is it to you that your child is participating in that program, it's over 70%. So this is not a question of desire of parents. It's not a question of demand. There's some breakdown happening in getting access to the programs that are really meaningful, that will provide kids with those durable skills that they can then take into the workforce. And as you said, the flip side of this is college. So we also asked that question. I'm sorry. So this is just on college preparation. So how confident are you that your child will be prepared for entrance into and success in college upon graduation from high school? And again, similar story, maybe even a little bit more dramatically, where the numbers are pretty low for overall for national, the blue. They're even lower in Wisconsin, and Wisconsin is behind its peer neighboring states on this question. And I think this is something where parents are saying something pretty important here we need to listen to.
Yeah, when there's an annual report that's put out that's mandated by the legislature that looks at the extent to which students need remedial classes from every high school in the state when they go to college. And I'll just note that it's worth looking at. Those numbers are pretty shocking in some instances. Some high schools are getting students into college where 30 or 40% of their graduates need to take some entry level or pre-entry level classes. So I think the extent of remediation really shows the extent to which folks are accurate in their perceptions here for sure.
Yeah, and I think college is really expensive, and we talk about that all the time, the cost of college. But what is incredibly expensive is to go to college and not finish.
Yep.
You end up with the debt without the degree. It's also really expensive if you can't get it done in 4 years because you're remediating through that first year. So I think you're exactly right. Parents are right to be concerned. It's a very costly thing to send a kid off to college when they don't have the skills they need to thrive, and the data is suggesting in far too many cases that that's exactly what's happening. All right, so let's talk about some crucial issues around recovery. So one of the biggest topics in education the past 2 years has been around tutoring, which I think makes a lot of sense for two reasons. One is that given school closures and disruptions and chronic absenteeism, we've seen unprecedented levels of learning loss. In a lot of cases, tests are showing that kids have dropped back to the level we haven't seen since the 1990s. At the same time, there's a lot of research that shows that one-on-one and small group tutoring can be one of the most effective interventions to catch kids back up. And so we wanted to understand, given that, how many kids have access to tutoring. So we asked parents that, has your kid received academic tutoring in the past year? You can see it's not a huge amount overall nationwide, it's about 19%, but even lower in Wisconsin, just 12%, and a huge gap here. One of the rare places where there is a big income gap between low-income families and middle and high-income families, who are about twice as high on tutoring.
Yeah, and what we wanted to point out here and why we thought this was particularly interesting is we've seen around the country, school states that are implementing school choice are now implementing education savings accounts more often than traditional voucher programs. And when you think about the advantages potentially of an ESA, one of them is obviously you could potentially use some of that funding for tutoring services, whereas a voucher program doesn't allow things like that. So while we have a governor currently who's unlikely to be willing to move in that direction, I think this, or I'll ask you, do you think maybe this speaks to the potential benefits in ESA and evening those things out?
I think that's exactly right. And I think you've seen a discussion that's shifted over time from just my kid needs a great school to my kid needs a great education. And increasingly, a great education is more than just that school. It's all the other support systems that are involved. So I think seeing the evolution of expanding choice from just a kind of a school voucher, where you're just making that one-to-one choice with the school, to an ESA, I think really speaks to that need in families. And what we found, which is really interesting, when we looked at the poll and we sliced it by income, we could look all the way up to the children of millionaires, which was sort of interesting. That's what you can do with the 20,000 person poll. And basically at every step along the way, the more resources a family had, the more they took advantage of all of these things. So the tutoring level of the children of millionaires is actually over 80%. So they're really taking advantage of these things. And obviously not all of us can have access to all those resources, but I think if we can make more resources available to families, this is how they want to spend it. All right, so let's dig into how parents use information to understand how their kids are doing, and exercise that ground level accountability. So as we were talking about before, there's no one way to understand how your kids are doing. So we wanted to understand the different ways people use information. So we asked parents, how do you use this source of information to understand how your kids are doing? So we looked at grades on report cards, grades on assignments, state tests, what you hear from your own child, what you hear from your teacher, parent-teacher conferences. What we found again is like none of these popped up to a majority of families. So generally families aren't using these in really high levels. It was interesting to look in terms of Wisconsin where it was above or below. So the Wisconsin parents are less likely to use grades on report cards, for example, to understand how their kids are doing, less likely to use grades on assignments or tests, and a little more likely to use what they hear from their child's teacher, or what they hear in parent-teacher conferences. So that was pretty interesting. And I will say this the grades on report cards question is a big one for us, because we've seen so much grade inflation. What we've been hearing from parents is they no longer trust that an A is actually an A level of work.
Yeah, I think this sort of points back to what we were talking about earlier to some extent, right? With the sort of changing gaming of the system with report cards, and maybe it's no longer a reliable metric. Yeah, I think it's interesting to see the variation here. I would have liked to have been in the 6 or 7% there that rely on what the child tells me a few times when I was in school, but yeah, didn't have that luxury.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. So this is a big one. that when we got these results back, we were really trying to, make sense of it and think about, all these questions about like, how do you know how your kid is doing? So this is the percentage of families that are extremely confident that they have a clear understanding of how well their kid is achieving academically. And what you see with these numbers when you kind of rank them all up is that Florida's at the top, along with Louisiana. Those are two states that have put a lot of priority on this. Wisconsin is about in the middle, and then New Mexico, New Hampshire at the bottom. And so I think this suggests there's room for improvement here, that parents do feel like they need more tools. And I think it's on us to figure out what tools are going to make the greatest difference for parents to feel that level of confidence.
Yeah, I don't want to put you on the spot with this, but Florida has a pretty big gap, at least in terms of some income groups relative to the rest of the country. Can you speak a little more about what they might be doing there that's so effective in that regard?
Yeah, so I think Florida is very famous for some things that do cut through the noise. So we were talking about parents being intimidated by spreadsheets. Sometimes when you log on to a state's website and you try to figure out how a school's doing, you feel like you need a master's degree to make sense of it, and they often use a lot of wiggle words. I know that they were one of the pioneers in the A to F grading system. And even though that can be a blunt instrument, I think what we hear from families is like, that makes a difference for them. And they really, if your school gets an F, that feels like, you really know what's going on. And I think generally that sense of being really crisp and clear with people seems to be cutting through. All right, let's check out the next one here. So this is one of the interesting things, and I was so glad for your leadership in pairing these things together, is to take what parents are telling us and then take the other information we have and compare those together, because perception isn't always reality. And so what was interesting here, this is a question that asks, do you believe your child is performing above grade level in reading? And you can see that almost half of all parents think their kid is above grade level in Wisconsin in reading. And then at the bottom of that, you've got the actual results. You want to speak a little to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'll say this is the most recent forward exam results. So we have the inflation of grades that we've seen. So if we'd use what we would perceive of as the more accurate results from the NAEP that were NAEP aligned from last year, it would have even been lower. But you see, and this is it's an approximation of above grade level. We're thinking of maybe that's equivalent, similar to advanced. Obviously, there's a little bit of wiggle room there. But yeah, we're looking at about 11.6% of kids that are scoring advanced on the forward exam in reading, versus 43% of parents that think that's the case. So it speaks again, I guess, to the divide in terms of perception versus reality, and maybe the need to be a little more clear and a little more tough in terms of the way that we discuss these issues with parents, so that they're flagged early on, so there can be time for improvement.
That's great. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think we're going to see a lot more conversation about this going forward. And I do think that we all have a responsibility, starting with the schools themselves, to make sure parents know where their kids stand. All right, so this is another really interesting perception reality one. I'm so glad again that you're featuring this one. So there's a lot of debate about how much money you spend on schools, and we wanted to understand, just at the most basic level, how much money do parents think is being spent per student. So you can see the answers on the left and the percentage of people who thought that on the right. So,
and I meant to put on here, we're actually at about $18,000 per kid. So
18,000. Okay. So that's good benchmark there. So that would fall in the 15 to 20,000 level. Only 4% of people correctly identified that as how much Wisconsin is spending per pupil on schools. 13% said less than 1,000. 23% said between 1,000 and 5,000. Another 12 between 5,000 and 10,000. So it really suggests that people don't understand how much money is being spent on schools right now.
Yeah, we thought this was important to include, just because we regularly hear about the need for more money in schools, and and there can be some circumstances that justify it. But I think it's important for folks to have a understanding of what we're actually spending. One thing we say is that a classroom of 15 to 20 kids, which is actually a large classroom in Wisconsin with the shrinking enrollment, we have over $300,000 of taxpayer money, right, sitting in that classroom. So To a lot of folks that sounds like a lot of money. We think to our teachers that are underpaid in many instances, we ought to be asking where a lot of that money is going. But in order to do that, folks need to have a basic understanding of what we are spending. And it does seem with these poll results that that's not necessarily the case in a lot of instances.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that pairs well with the low numbers that we saw in terms of parents feeling like they know how budget decisions are made. The combination of these two suggests that's true, and there's a lot more work to do there. Great. So you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, I'll wrap it up and then we'll get into the Q&A. So I see we have a good number of questions in there already, but if folks have things they want to add, feel free to get those in there now. So as we've discussed throughout this, I think we see a pretty vast information gap between what the information that Department of Public Instruction has and families. We have a lack of understanding about how kids are doing in school, a lack of understanding about how much we're spending. And we're not trying to say this is on parents. Right, we're just pointing out this gap exists because in many instances, our Department of Public Instruction is working to hide the true information. They're trying to bury things under layers of bureaucracy, so it's hard to find the data. There was a Arizona State a study recently that looked at how easy it is to find information about schools. Wisconsin was ranked very low on that because it's challenging to find the data. They're changing the standards so that it's difficult to compare year to year or impossible to compare year to year about how kids are performing. So we have this huge information gap. So, what that leads to is the reality that, assuming we're going to continue to have an educational entity in this state that's not going to be friendly towards improvement, then I think the answer is, that we need even more choice. And that choice isn't just private school choice. That choice can include open enrollment. That choice also includes, market forces sort of creating the impetus for gathering information, providing information from maybe private entities as well. We also can see that creativity and innovation are needed on our public school side. Again, we see a lack of services for folks that want to get into the workforce. And we even see it on the college side, right, where we see that folks don't feel like their needs are being adequately met when it comes to preparing kids for college. So we see a need for improvement across the board that can involve more choice, but also on the public school side, it's incumbent to begin to look at some of the demands that parents have. And with that, I will turn to the Q&A. The very first question from Emily Hines is, how are folks chosen to participate in the survey?
Yeah, great question. So the goal of the survey was for each state to be as representative as possible. So the survey is a hybrid survey. It uses a mixture of text messaging and phone calls to recruit a representative sample. And then they're asked questions as they go through to full completion. The total questionnaire, which you can find on our website at 50can.org, was 71 questions.
Great. And the follow-up from Emily was the survey anonymous? Was it electronic survey or in person? And were participants compensated?
They were not compensated. It is anonymous. And it was with the text messaging, you went to a website, so you clicked through the answers. It was phone. It was conveyed to them over the phone.
Great. Just an observation from George Mitchell. He said, nearly a third of parents feel like they don't have a choice. So while we're ranking relatively high, I think in absolute terms, we still have work to do. I think that's absolutely a good point, that even in these areas where we look relatively in a good spot, there's still a large group of people in those other categories that don't feel like they have choice. So good observation there. Question from Fred: is there a similar or comparable survey from 20 years ago or so that would show how parent sentiments have changed on these issues or may not have shifted?
That's a good question. I am not aware of any survey like this in terms of a 50-state survey 20 years ago. There's some really good survey resources out there. So for some of our benchmarking of the survey, we tried to go and look at what else exists. So I would say Pew Research is a great resource, and they do have polls that go back a good ways. Another good one is Gallup has surveys that go back a good ways, and they've obviously done a lot of education polling over the years, but not all of these questions show up.
Looks like we have some folks from other states in here as well, so you can plug your other work. But this question was, are we able to get some statistics for other states like Virginia?
Yes. So, okay. So yes. We have, if you go to our website, 50can.org, 50can.org, we have a 215-page report that you can download that goes through all 50 states. So you can look at those trends. You can also download them individually. So there's like a drop-down menu. So you can just select Virginia and pull that up. And then where in about half the country, we have state partners. And so those state partners have done more in-depth reports at that level. I don't think we've done Virginia.
Very cool. Yeah, and I'd invite folks to take a look because there's a lot more stuff we couldn't cover here. That the real wealth of information there for sure. So another question for Mark, and this is actually something I was thinking of. So a good question here. On the chart about workforce preparation, they noticed that the southern states were a little bit higher. They said, I think intuitively most might expect Midwestern states to be higher, especially with the prevalence of manufacturing and youth apprenticeship programs. So I guess, do we have any thoughts as to why that might be the case in the South?
So, it definitely matches up with my experience. Like one of the cool things about 50can is we get to interact with a lot of people all over the country. And I would say lately the South has been pretty bullish on their economy. And I think you've seen people moving more to the South since the pandemic. And I think you've seen some major business investments. And so I think it matches up with that general trend. And I think that optimism, we'll see if it gets matched up with the next 5 to 10 years of actual job growth. I think that's the big question.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's interesting, and I do think I intuitively would have thought the opposite as well, just because, and we do see some of those apprenticeship programs here anecdotally, but maybe not living up to what is needed for sure. Next question from Kim Desatel: how does Wisconsin compare to national numbers on the equipped questions from parents? So how equipped XYZ on a couple of those dimensions?
That's a good question. So I think in general, Wisconsin is in about the middle of the country on a lot of those questions. And I think that speaks to the sort of general trend of parents hungering for more in an area, where maybe public policy can make a difference.
Cool. Next question is one I think I can answer. From Emily Hines: what percentage of folks in Wisconsin have a college degree? I think we're at about 32%, which is pretty close to the national average. I think very slightly below the national average, but pretty close to the national average there. Next question from Kathy Gorse: is there a study regarding remediation for college available for Wisconsin by school? Yes, I can. I'll see if I can get it in time to put in the chat. If not, I'm happy to reach out to you. But that is a report put out annually by our report to the legislature every year that lists by school the percentage of folks that are needing remedial classes in college. And I'll try to find that if I have time before this is over. Like I said, feel free to reach out if I can't locate that. Another question from Emily: is tutoring provided in school or out of school with parent cost? I'd imagine it's both, right? Both kinds of tutoring could be encompassed by the results there.
Yeah, and it's a really good question because I probably should have highlighted this. One of the things we were interested in is how kids are getting access to things regardless of what provider is providing them. So a lot of times when you see these surveys, they're just focused in on like public school students or just district provided services. So this captures everything. And I think that might fit well with as we have more creative policy solutions like ESAs, and that helps with things like tutoring, then it'll be captured. And our goal is to do the survey again in 2026, and hopefully we'll see some uptick.
Great. One more from Emily: what is an ESA? I can try to define that quickly for us. ESA is called it's an education savings account. Sounds like a health savings account, but it's somewhat different. Essentially, it's a state-provided amount of money that can be used for educational services. Beyond just tuition at a private school, it might be usable for things like tutoring, like we were just discussing, or specific classes that are relevant to the child that might not be offered in their schools in their area. So some online courses, supplemental activities to some extent that might not be available in schools. George Mitchell with another one: do the crosstabs let us understand who feels they don't have a choice? And I guess if you can elaborate on who are the folks that don't feel like they have a choice either in Wisconsin or nationwide?
Yeah, that's a good question. So generally, in most states, what we see is that low-income families feel like they have less of a choice than upper-income families. And usually that's because when upper-income families in states feel like they have a choice, they can dip into their own money to get their kids out of a school that's not working for them. And that's why I think it's notable that in Wisconsin you don't see that gap. Interestingly, and this was true in a lot of questions, we didn't see huge racial differences on those kind of questions between, say, like white and Black, Asian, and Hispanic on choice. Generally speaking, people in urban areas are more likely to feel like they have a choice than people in rural areas. I think that's a function both of the kinds of programs that have been targeted at urban areas in a lot of states, and also a function of just population density and what's made available in rural communities, and the transportation challenge.
Absolutely, yeah, that makes sense. And that's obviously varies within states, but obviously those commonalities across the board sort of makes sense from that data. Question from Michelle. During your study, did you identify any school districts that were doing a solid, great job educating the thing move, but did you identify districts or states that were doing a good job overall, or what were some of the top performers?
So just given the size of the country and how many school districts we have of 14,000, I think, we weren't able to sample school districts. We were only able to sample states at a statistically significant level. But interestingly, because we included the District of Columbia, which is one school district, we were able to include them. They, in most cases, were at the top in a lot of these dimensions. And I think that's a reflection of, in DC, they have a very aggressive charter school program, which captures about half of all students. They have a private school choice program. There's also increasingly a lot of wealth and people exercising a lot of their own resources, and that popped them up to the top across a lot of these dimensions.
One more from Kim that I can answer is if you take, we're at about 18,000 K per kid I mentioned with the slide about not understanding spending. Kim was asking, if you take out Milwaukee, how does that change? That's a good question. Milwaukee certainly drives the cost to some extent. But Milwaukee's approaching $25,000 per kid. We're at $24,292. I looked it up while we were looking for the most recent data. So taking MPS out will definitely lower it to some extent, though. As one of 422 school districts, it's not going to have a dramatic impact, and there's pretty high spending across the board, or at least similar spending. Let's see what else. We have a couple more questions open, so if anybody has anything left, feel free to add it now. Scarlett asks, school funding also includes federal dollars. Do you think parents have no idea how much is spent? Let's see. Do you think parents have no idea how much is spent on education? If they knew, do you think their perception of the quality of education would change with their education being in question?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I would say my great fear is that over the next 10 or 20 years, we see a significant increase in education that doesn't meaningfully change anything for kids and families. And I think that could happen. If you look at a place like New York City, they spend about $38,000 per pupil. And I think if you were to go into a New York City classroom, it wouldn't feel any different for you than a classroom in Wisconsin. And so we know there is a way for this to get much more expensive without more access to tutoring, without more individualized attention, without more choices, summer programs, all these other things you might want. So that, I think that's a big challenge. And I think honestly, part of the reflection is parents don't see where the money's being spent. So that's probably why they think there's not as much going around. And we hear about these crazy things like teachers having to, go into their own pockets to pay for school supplies. And you wonder, where's all the money going?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, knowing this information, people don't really have a perception of, 10,000 versus 15,000 necessarily, but eventually you start getting those higher numbers and folks say, that's a lot. That's, half of what I made last year, right? And that's what we're spending per student. So I think while the individual, moving from 11 to 12,000 probably doesn't make much difference, as you move up the scale in these large amounts, I think it certainly is meaningful. Last question we have in the chat for now, and Mark, I'll let you start with this, and then I'll follow with some of our own specific policies. But just in general, from the poll, are there any state level solutions you think are really important from what's revealed here?
Well, I think there are states we can look to and draw some conclusions about why they seem to be so high. The state that most consistently does well across all of these dimensions, if you set aside DC, which is just one district, is Florida. And so I think a lot of the work that's been done in Florida over the past 10 or 15 years seems to be paying off for kids. And I think we should spend more time looking there. So I think that's kind of a big one for us that we're pointing to.
Yeah, absolutely. That's key to look at the states that are doing well. I think a couple things for us for the upcoming year. We saw a lot of stuff in a lot of results here that look at failures and understanding when it comes to student accountability. As I mentioned on a couple of those slides, there was a move by the DPI to lower the bar. There's been across the board, even including Governor Evers, complaints about that decision. The higher standards were put in place when the governor was the superintendent. So we're certainly looking at moving back to the higher standards, and that way we'll have consistency across the board in how schools are judged. Which even if a school, if your overall proficiency is lowered, it's important to know that, but so you have that sort of trajectory to see where trends are going. In terms of other things, I think preserving and improving our school choice programs is key. We have a number of limitations on our programs here for income levels. Obviously with Governor Evers, we're not going to move to an ESA, but in the long term, that's something we'd like to see. But just opening up more options and making sure we're all starting from the same point of information, I think are some of the keys at the state level we can look at for the upcoming year. Last question that was put in here, and we'll end with this one for the moment. Where do we go for each state to find the amount of spending per student? I can tell you it's the National Digest of Education Statistics. I don't think I'll have time before this is over to get you the specific table, but there is a table there that shows spending per student. I don't know if Mark have any easier resource, but that's where I usually go for that.
No,
data.
I think that sounds right. Yeah.
Great. So Mark, I don't know if you want to give any sort of final thoughts here, and then we'll give ours as well.
Yeah, well, I just say thank you for spending some time with us and learning about the survey. We want it to be as useful to folks as possible. As I mentioned, you can go to our website and dig into all the data. In addition to the reports we've put together and the reports that our partners have put together, you can actually download the full data set. And you are welcome to take it and use it. And we hope it is useful. And I think I can say for our campaigns that we're doing this year, one of the things we're trying really hard to do is when we're talking about policies, we're grounding it in the results of the survey. And I think that's really powerful. So when we're doing work, it always grows out of what we're hearing from parents.
Great. I'll just start by thanking Mark and 50CAN for partnering with us on this. This has been great for giving us insights for our policy work as well as just sort of informing the picture of the education landscape in Wisconsin. I put my email in the chat there. If folks have follow-up questions that they didn't get to ask, feel free to reach out to me and I can either answer them or pass them on to the folks at 50CAN to work on. But thanks to everyone for joining us. And yeah, please feel free to reach out if you have any further thoughts, and have a good rest of your day. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.